Fear Not, episode 155. Hi, I'm Billy Atwell, and I believe that consistently facing your fears is the only way to realize your truest self and to make those confident choices that will help you to obtain your deepest held hopes and dreams. I have faith that this podcast series will show you that you are not alone, that it will strengthen you and give you courage to face your fears, and that it will help you to permanently cross over into a life of living beyond your fears. Join me on this journey as we listen and learn from others as they share their experiences in facing and overcoming their own fears. Hello, everybody. Today, you and I are going to be joined by kdavies. Welcome, Kyle. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you, Billy. Thank you very much for having me on the show today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Kyle is a chartered psychologist, therapist, coach, speaker, and author. He is also the creator of Energy Flow Coaching, a mind-body approach to help people achieve optimum well-being and experience greater personal freedom. He has spent the last 15 years helping sufferers of chronic health challenges such as chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, depression, and anxiety recover their health and lead happy, fulfilled lives. Kyle, can you take a few extra moments to fill in those gaps and maybe also give us a brief glimpse of your personal life?
A brief glimpse of my personal life. Wow, that's one thing that is almost never asked on podcasts, really. So that's a good place to start. So yeah, just looking in terms of what you're saying, I've spent a long time working with people with chronic health challenges. I suffered from anxiety myself between ages probably 17 and about 24. And I came through that, and I don't really know. Well, at the time, I didn't know how. So I was very curious about that. I think that probably played a factor in my desire to be a therapist, really, because I went and did a whole load of different types of training: NLP, hypnosis, CBT, tapping, counseling. I did loads of stuff. And I did try to understand what it was that I'd managed to do. And the question wasn't really answered, I think, in the therapies that I trained in, but it answered itself as I began to develop energy flow coaching, and I can talk a bit more about that as we go. So, in terms of my personal circumstances, well, I'm married. I've got two daughters. I play guitar in a rock band on weekends for fun, and yeah, that's me in a nutshell. And I live in sunny Wales. Oh, it's sunny today, but it's actually very rarely sunny. It's usually very, very rainy.
Kyle, can we start off today by having you help us to understand what fear is?
Fear, from my perspective, is different from anxiety. And I suppose my work is all about our emotional feelings. So it's a kind of a very big area for me. At a simple level, I think it can be useful to look at fear as missing information. Now, there's a slight caveat here. The caveat is that I believe that our emotion comes from, and our feelings come from inside of us. And I think we often have that sense that our emotions are caused by life outside of us. But my sense is that our perceptions of life, and also the things that turn up or show up in our daily lives, are often a reflection back to us of our own kind of vibrational state. So I think that we often get into that space of believing that something outside of us causes us fear, or something outside of us causes us anger. And I'd say it doesn't work quite like that. It's actually that the feelings that we have are a reflection of our level of vibrational resonance. And we can look at possibly what our perceptions and our beliefs are as well. Now, that's kind of one thing. At a very simple level, it can be useful to look at fear as about missing information. So, for example, if I was to sit a driving test in the morning, it may be that my body would send me the emotion of fear in the form of nervousness. And I could say, well, that nervousness is sent because I don't know what the examiner will be like. I don't know what route he will take me on. I don't know if I'll remember the highway code and what to do. And as a result, my body sends me those feelings of nervousness. Now, attaching that to what I was just saying earlier, of course, all of that comes from within me and is about my perceptions. Now, when I then get in the car the following day and I have my driving test, as I sit down in that car, I meet the exam and I start to drive, I learn the route. As that information comes in, my body sends less fear, and that fear then is probably replaced with some other emotions. So I think it's a very, very simple way of looking at fear, but I think it can be useful. And the reason I use it is because, as I say, I tend to look at anxiety as being different from fear. And the reason I do that is because I believe anxiety is a set of symptoms rather than an emotion. So I look at fear, and you could look at dread, scared, nervous as being fear emotions, whereas anxiety, whilst there can be an overlap, so a huge amount of fear can trigger anxiety symptoms. It's also the case that anxiety, which from a perspective of kind of academia and medicine is sort of an umbrella term for what could be a vast range of symptoms. Uh, Anxiety is symptoms, and just to give I just wanted to give a couple of quick examples of that, kind of real life examples. So quite recently, I had a lady phone me, and she was saying to me that she experienced anxiety, wanted some help with it, and she wanted to tell me about the last time she'd had a kind of panic attack, I guess. And she explained that she was taking her kids to school and it was raining heavily and they were running late, and her son had forgotten his football kit, so they had to come back. And then she was driving fast and the traffic was heavy and it was raining heavily, and they got to school and there wasn't anywhere to park, so she had to pull up on the sidewalk, and there were other cars that were kind of honking their horns, and the kids got out the car, and there was sort of tension in the car for the whole journey. As soon as the kids got out the car, she got back in the car. She had this anxiety attack, and she said to me, I was trying to work out what I was frightened of, and which of course she just couldn't figure it out. And I said, well, the issue is that you're not actually frightened. What you're experiencing is anxiety here, and the reason you're experiencing that anxiety is that they're symptoms. And in this moment, it's because you've had a buildup of a lot of emotion that you've tried to shove down inside of you. And it's the shoving down of that emotion rather than allowing yourself to feel it and maybe adjust what you're doing. Because this is, if our emotion is feedback about our interaction with our environment, if we shove it down inside, if we don't pay attention to it, then it's almost as if our body will tries to get our attention in some other way. And symptoms is one of the ways in which it does that. So I think that was an important factor for her, because she was trying to search around at, for ideas about where this fear was coming from. The second example I wanted to give is actually a friend of mine, and this gives you an idea, I suppose, about how stress in the body can trigger symptoms. So this friend of mine likes to run, and he used to run long distance events, and then he started to run 10K races and things like that. And he had this focus on running a 10K, and he would run every day, and he kept a spreadsheet, and he had it in his mind that he wanted to improve his time every time that he went out, which is pretty much every day. So he'd take his kit, his shorts, and his trainers, whatnot, to work, and he would run during his lunch hour. And I was over his house one evening. He was saying to me, he said, it's really weird. He said, I'm beginning to have anxiety around 11:30 in the morning, which is about half an hour before I go for my run. He said, I'm trying to work out why I'm nervous, because I'm running the same route. So why am I scared? It doesn't make any sense to me. So like the lady in the first example, I said, well, the issue is you're not actually afraid. It's not fear. what's going on is that your body is kind of in a state of stress. Now, one of the interesting things I think about stress is that stress is far more than that kind of agitated feeling that we have. And our body can, there's a whole series of things that can trigger the stress response in our body. And you could have some form of injury, you could have some form of illness, or you could have a buildup of emotion. The stress response that's triggered in the body is exactly the same. So you could have a car accident, a bad case of flu, or lose a job. And the stress response is exactly the same. So for my friend, he had various issues that were happening at work, which meant that there was a lot of emotion in his stress bucket arising from that. And when it came to his running, the if we exercise very hard, again that triggers the stress response. In the same way that if we don't sleep well, the body goes into a state of stress. So because he sort of decided in his mind that he was going to run regardless of whether he felt like it or not, and he had to get a personal best, he was putting a huge amount of pressure on himself. Plus, he was stressing his body. So his stress bucket was essentially full. And then again, his body was letting him know through sending these symptoms. But this is another example where we can look at anxiety as, in my view, as being different from emotions of fear. So I guess my definition of fear, it may be a little bit simple, but it can be an easy way to try to understand, am I feeling fear in this context, or is it anxiety symptoms? And there's a number of things that can lead to anxiety as opposed to fear. But I think it can be a useful starting point to just raise that question of, is there any missing information or unknown information here? Is there something therefore that I'm worried or concerned about? Is there something that I don't want to happen that might happen, or I don't know what's going to happen? Or if there isn't any information that's missing, it may be that it's anxiety that I'm experiencing. So that's my kind of perspective on fear. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And I was hoping maybe you could talk about that a little bit more and help us to understand how we could better engage with our emotions because, sometimes, let's be honest, they can be so high and intense that we're clouded in our judgment. We might do something wrong. What can we do to maybe step back from the emotion and do this analyzing that you're talking about?
I wouldn't say it's analysing as such. I suppose it's an awareness, I hope, of allowing ourselves to feel what we feel. I think the first point is definitely being open to what we feel. I think there's a few things that probably take place. The first thing is that when we experience an uncomfortable feeling, then it tends to be the case that our thinking centers become active. And one of the first things that we do is resist what it is that we're feeling. So our thinking kind of ramps up. We start analyzing. We start rationalizing in our mind. We try to find meaning, or we try to solve the feelings that we're having. So there's almost like an instinctive resistance to anything that's uncomfortable. It's almost as if we see it as a problem. And to a certain extent, it's not surprising because if science is right, what it currently says is that when we experience a physical pain, the same areas of the brain are lighting up, if you will, as when we're experiencing an emotional discomfort, which is probably why we say that it's emotional pain. So there is that kind of instinctive thing, which I think it's useful for us to move beyond. I think that kind of mastery of life to a certain extent comes from allowing ourselves to tolerate some emotional discomfort without trying to solve it, without trying to find meaning in it, but just allow it to be. So I think the first thing is getting into the body and simply allowing whatever the feelings are. So when it comes to our, as I say, our feelings, for me, whether you experience hunger, tiredness, anger, fear, joy, they're all feelings. what we often do, and what I often experience in my work, is when I ask people about feelings, they often give what their mental interpretation is. So they'll give some explanation. And even if I ask them, they may say that it originated in their head. And I think it's because we're such a culture that is dominated by thinking. And this starts from when we're very young. We focus our energy in our head. We channel everything through that mental part of us. We analyze everything, that we're so used to doing that we kind of lose sight of the fact that actually there's many instances that we don't need to do that. We'd be better off just allowing ourselves to feel. So the first, in answer to that, to your question, the first stage, I would say, is being in that space of believing that everything I feel is okay, and what I feel is not a problem. Those are two, I guess, two experiences or realizations that I personally had, which were absolutely profound for me as a person that feels a great deal. I found that I would resist to start with. I'd resist what I felt because I would be finding meaning in it. It meant I was a certain type of person. So I didn't want to be the sort of person that felt this emotion, this fear or this anger or whatever it was. I wanted to be a stronger person or a different person. So when I had the first realization, well, everything I feel is okay. It was like a massive weight off. And then I had this other realization that what I feel is not a problem. I don't have to solve it. Because the thing I was aware of was a tension that I was holding. And I had this sense that, well, there's a kind of a white noise of chatter in my head. And that white noise of chatter is a resistance to whatever emotion I'm having. And of course, our feelings fluctuate. They kind of go up and down. Sometimes we have a sense of why that may be, and other times we don't. Emotions and feelings can move and change. So simply allowing them to be without doing all that mental work, without believing that we have to solve them, I think is profound. It's that idea that it doesn't mean, me saying it doesn't have to be solved. That doesn't mean that there's not something out there in life that I want to take action on. If my car is stolen, there's a good chance that my body will send some feelings about that because of the perceptions and beliefs I have about owning my car. And what I'd say is whatever emotion I have, the fear, anger, whatever that might arise, the emotion doesn't need to be solved. Now that doesn't mean that I don't need to phone the police and the insurance company and whatever else. But what it means is that the action I take is not about trying to get rid of the emotion that I feel. The emotion I feel doesn't have to be solved. So I think for me, that's the key starting point, is that, in terms of, I think it's a great point that you made, that it can often be the case that our emotion will cloud our thinking. And it does. If there's a lot of emotion, we know it kind of takes over our thinking centers. And sometimes we do have to step back and just recognize that that's what's going on, and allow ourselves to feel what we feel. And if we may need to decide something, maybe we need to kind of wait 5 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour, whatever it is. But I think that often what happens with that, in my sense of it, is that it's often the case that the initial body emotion that we have is very often not that big. But what usually happens is the emotion leads to the triggering of the activation of the thinking centers of the brain. When the thinking centers become active, we go through that analyzing process where we're judging. We're probably judging external events. And I say, going back to what I was saying earlier, when we can embed that notion, all right, well, my emotion is about me. It's coming from inside of me and it's flowing through me. So it's not that it's about those external events. So there's no point in me judging my boss or my neighbor or that man in that car. What I need to do is just allow myself to feel this, because what's happening is this is reflecting back to me my vibrational state. So let me feel what I feel, and if in this context I desire to take some action, let me take some constructive action. But when we we take away that judgment, and then we remove that desire to analyze, to solve, and to find meaning in the emotional feelings that we have, then it's often the case that the emotion's actually just not that big. I think so much of the time, as soon as our head gets involved, our emotion is just it's huge. And just to give another example of that, that really hit home to me when I was saying, I've got two daughters. When my eldest daughter was about 18 months old, she hit that terrible two phase where kids have tantrums. And my experience of it was that tantrums are kind of different from a child being upset. If they're upset about something, it's they cry and then they process it, and then a few minutes later they're happy again. When they have a tantrum, it's sort of different. It's part of the maturation process, I think. And it's once they have a tantrum and it kind of kicks in, it's almost like you've got to wait for it to burn itself out. You can't calm them down as such. Well, that was certainly my experience of it. Anyway, I'd had a 2-week period of for whatever reason, feeling a huge amount of internal anger. And in relation, it seemingly, as my brain was making a connection, seemingly in relation to little things my daughter was doing. And I sat down one evening with my wife and said, I've got to figure this out. I wasn't acting out this anger. It was all internal. So I was feeling almost rage like emotions. And so I've got to figure out what's going on here. And I said, so the next morning, I was with my daughter getting her dressed for trip to nursery, and we were halfway through the process of getting her dressed, and she just burst into this tantrum. And within seconds, I could feel this rage erupting within me. So I'm sort of able to I'm self-aware enough to be able to observe myself. So I figured I need to take myself away, and I'm going to just observe what's going on here. And what I was aware of was that I was kind of in my head, and my head was resisting what was happening. My head was just saying, why can't you get dressed? Why are you kicking off again? We need to go out soon. And as I had that awareness, I just gently nudged my attention back into my body, just to feel the physical sensations of the emotion that was there. And as I did that, the emotion I felt, it was almost like just being turned down. It just went from probably like an 8 or a 9 in terms of how intense it was, down to probably a 3. And I just sort of sat with that for a moment, and then bounced back up into my head. And as soon as I bounced back up into my head, the volume was turned up, and I was back to an 8 or a 9 again. And this again was a revelation to me. I could then see that, oh my God, this is, what's going on here is my head in resisting what's the thing that I'm experiencing here is blowing this emotional feeling up, and it's making it absolutely massive. So I just pulled my attention back into my body, allowed myself to breathe, allowed myself to feel the frustration that I felt. And without really thinking about it, I just had a sense of, okay, so what can I do with this now? And I felt, well, there's nothing I can really do, so I might as well just get dressed myself, let myself feel this emotion, and just see what happens. Which is exactly what I did. So my daughter was just outside of her bedroom, and she had this tantrum for the next, I don't know, minute, I guess. And I got dressed, and I wasn't fixated on my emotional feeling, but I was aware that frustration was there. I wasn't trying to solve it. I wasn't trying to analyze it. I was just in my body, breathing. I was getting dressed myself, putting on my trousers, putting on my shirt. And then as her tantrum subsided, my levels of frustration, dropped. But that dropped from like a 3 to a 0 rather than being up at 8 or 9. And I think that my sense of it is that's often the case. That point that you made about it's often very overwhelming. I think very, very quickly what happens is that people experience an emotion, they resist the feeling. They in their head kicks in. They resist the circumstances that they believe are provoking or triggering that emotion, and it's that resistance and mental chatter, whether they're conscious of the mental chatter or not, is what amplifies their emotional discomfort from something mild right up to something very intense. So that, in terms of the kind of the take homes from that, I would say being curious simply about the sensations of the emotions, the emotional feelings you have, is definitely the starting point, really. And being in that space where you believe, I don't have to solve this emotion. I can simply let this emotion be. And if you're a parent out there and you feel anger, as in relation to things that happened at home, just let it be. You don't have to solve it. You don't have to react to it, because that's the other thing. We don't want to be behaving in a destructive way, because when we do that, what tends to happen is we get more emotion of the same type. So just allowing an emotion to be without, it's often the case. You can think, oh, I shouldn't feel this. I shouldn't feel this anger. My child is so good normally. I shouldn't feel this anger. What I would say, well, just let yourself feel whatever you feel without trying to find any meaning in it or trying to solve it. Just allow it to be. And if it's guiding you to take some action, then take some action. But if not, just let it be there.
Kyle, you were talking about how you believe that fear and anxiety are different and that usually there are symptoms, that anxiety is a symptom of something. Could you explain that a little bit more?
So I've talked a little bit about how a full, what I would call stress bucket, can result in symptoms of anxiety, and that can mean, as I was giving the example of my friend, where his body was in a state of stress from pushing it very hard, plus there was an emotional build-up from various things in his life. So it can be that if our body is in a state of stress, and certainly from my experience, so as I said at the start of the show, I experienced anxiety between ages 17 and 24. And there were a couple of crucial things that happened there. So one of them was I started drinking, started boozing. So obviously that is a stress, and especially when you're young at that age, that affected my sleep pattern. So I wasn't sleeping as I needed to be. I was, there were important exams at school, so there was a lot of emotion about that. So I started to have anxiety around that time, and there were a number of things in the stress bucket. Now, the other kind of big piece is when we, what I would say, wear a mask, or when we lose ourselves. And this was another factor for me. And I see this a huge amount with, because I have a lot of young people in my practice, and the for those with anxiety symptoms, the biggest piece is where they feel, when they're aware of it, when they are trying to fit in with life, when they are trying to project some sense of who they are or who they think they should be. And whilst at some level we all wear a mask, when our behavior is motivated more by an external reference, so more about how we believe others are perceiving us, the greater the chance we have of anxiety presenting itself. And again, it's the anxiety, I would say, like all of the symptoms for the health challenges I work with, it's a tap on the shoulder to let us know that something is not right. So it can be the case that anxiety can present itself if I am not being true to myself. So if my behavior, as I say, is driven by me trying to fit in, trying to be liked, trying to impress people, then if I'm doing that, anxiety will present itself. And of course, arguably, there are all sorts of reasons why that might happen. I may not feel good enough about myself and all of that kind of stuff. However, I think the fastest way out of it is to believe that there is a kind of true self that is me. Now, I think that I don't think there's one version of us, and I don't think we need to kind of define who we are. I think I often say to my clients is just be curious about who you might be, and recognize there are probably many aspects to who you are. And there'll be a strand or a thread that connects those aspects, but there are aspects. There's not one version of you. And, for me, part of what life is all about is having the experience of ourselves and allowing ourselves to experience these different aspects of us. But what's crucial, I think, in terms of feeling good and being healthy is that when we are experiencing these aspects, it needs to be driven by me experiencing me in this moment. This is me flowing. This is me experiencing my true self. And obviously, I'm not in my head as I'm doing that. I'm just allowing myself to be. So if I go to a party, and this is literally, this is me. I have the potential to be kind of gregarious and dance on the table, but I can also be very quiet and just talk to one person in the corner. And the most important thing is wherever I am on that spectrum in that party, it needs to be motivated by me just experiencing myself for the purposes of being me in that party. If I deviate from that, if I slip into a space of how should I be, how should I behave? Who should I talk to? What should I say? What should I wear? When I get into that space, anxiety will present itself. And just a little example of this. Earlier in the year, I was talking to a friend, and she was going to she was flying on a yoga trip, and she knew some of the people that she was going with. And she said to me a week before she was going, she said, "I'm having anxiety. I think it's anxiety about the flight." So as we talked, I initially didn't believe that. So I kind of questioned her. And as she was talking to me, there was one of the ladies that was going. She didn't get on with that well. And so what she was doing was she was beginning to plan and think about how she should act, what she should say, and how she should be around this lady. And I said, well, in doing that, you're putting that mask on, you're shackling yourself. And there is something about anxiety that when our freedom is removed, when we're constricted and constrained, again, the body presents these symptoms to us. And one of the things that I think is important for us to kind of really embraces this idea that being healthy and having a sense of well-being and feeling good arises in many instances from personal freedom. And that simply means an ability at any given moment to express who we are. And when we are in whatever way, if we prevent us, because it's only us that does it, but if we prevent ourselves from being free in each moment, then anxiety comes. And again, it's a tap on the shoulder. So for that example, as soon as I talked that through with my friend, the anxiety started to go. And it wasn't anxiety about the plane, but that's often what happens is our brain will decide, oh no, it's anxiety about this or anxiety about that. And this is very often the case in social settings. I've seen this over and over again. So if there's anyone out there listening and social things trigger some form of symptom for you, then I'd say that the critical thing to do is remember that you never have to plan how to be. What you want to do is simply allow yourself to unfold in the moment. If you go to a party and you notice yourself starting to think ahead of time about who you're going to talk to, how you're going to present yourself, what you're going to say, it'll be those things that are causing the anxiety that you're experiencing. So you don't have to think that, well, I've got social anxiety, this is just the way it is. I would say in that moment, as soon as you begin to feel the symptoms, bring your attention back into yourself and remind yourself that my job is simply to unfold as me. I don't need to plan how to be me. I can just allow myself to feel everything that I feel. I know that if I get into my head and I start planning what to say and how to be and who to dance with or whatever it is, then anxiety is very likely to present itself. So that those are the kind of the two big areas. But I've seen so much of that over the years, that kind of wearing a mask, performing, not being true to ourselves, shackling ourselves, constricting ourselves, trying to present ourselves and be a certain way. That is probably, I think, the biggest cause of anxiety. And I think that it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because we live in, certainly in Western culture, where anxiety is getting worse and worse and worse and worse. I think and we have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I think we set, as a result of these, we create inside of us this idea of pressure about how we should be presenting ourselves to the world. And I think people are increasingly aware of how they present themselves. And in this desire to fit in and to be liked and all the rest of it, and to be successful and to be seen to be happy and doing well, the modulation of self, the changing of self, the transmuting of self that we attempt to do, that takes us away from our true self, is actually the cause of the problem for us. So the key piece, I think, there is bringing it back to me and reminding myself that it's important just for me to be me. And I don't have to think about that. In fact, I can't think about it. If I begin to think about it, I begin to stop being me. It's one of those things that simply has to flow. So those are in terms of, what's the cause of anxiety, and trying to put it in a couple of boxes. It's a full stress bucket. And as I say, there's a number of things that can to be in a stress bucket. And the second bit is that deviation from self, the wearing the mask, the shackling oneself and removing one's own freedom. And as I say, I say one's own because I just think it's important that we kind of allow ourselves to believe that it isn't anyone else that does that to us. Again, often we can think that life is doing that to us. We have to behave in a certain way. We have to present ourselves. But as soon as we do that, we become disempowered, and then that leads to problems. So I hope that wasn't too waffly, and I hope that answers the question okay for you there, Billy.
It does, and you brought up some interesting points too. I've never really thought of as we continue to grow as a global community, that peer pressure or perceived peer pressure to conform and to give in is, I find that fascinating. I think we could probably talk another hour on that.
It just seems to be huge, isn't it? And I suppose that the thing that I've seen, if I go back to the years I've been in practice, it's only the last, I suppose, 6 years that I've had more and more young people. And I think it in many instances, this is what's going on. And I think part of the issue is that with the likes of Facebook, Twitter and whatnot, it's not that in and of themselves they're bad things, but they draw us to be very externally referenced. So we're constantly looking outside of ourselves, as I say, to fit in, to be normal, to be accepted. And it is even more than that, isn't it? It's because it's I've got to be successful. I've got to be seen to be happy. And I think, part of this comes when you see pictures on Facebook of people having a great time. Often we feel this, we kind of create this pressure within ourselves to have to be happy and doing the same sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's an interesting and worrying trend towards more anxiety in today's culture.
Yeah, it's not a new concept of keeping up with the Joneses. It just seems to be on a more epic scale. Indeed. Kyle, if someone would like to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, there's me talking about Facebook and Twitter. I'm on both. My website is kdavies.net, KYLEDAVIES.net. I'm on Facebook as Kyle Davis EFC, which is for Energy Flow Coaching, and I'm on Twitter as Kyle L Davis. So yeah, if anyone's got any questions about anything that I've talked about today, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me direct at kyle@energyflowcoaching.com. kdavies.com and be more than happy to answer questions or just read any thoughts and comments, really.
And Kyle, what parting advice would you like to leave with us today?
Parting advice is allow life to be simple and allow everything you feel to be okay, and allow yourself to be governed by that wisdom or that true self inside you as best you can.
That's excellent advice, and thank you so much for that. And I want to let everyone know, too, that Kyle has generously donated a copy of his book, The Intelligent Body, that we'll be giving away. So if you would like an opportunity to win, visit the giveaways page at livingbeyondyourfears.com and submit your free entry form today. Kyle, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking to us not only about fear and anxiety, but those core issues that sometimes we overlook and try to not to deal with. So thank you for helping us today. I appreciate it.
It's an absolute pleasure, Billy. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining me today. And remember, you cannot achieve everything, but you do have the God-given ability to achieve anything. So stay focused, out of fear, and keep on keeping on. Until next time, be well and peaceful. For more information on today's episode and guest, or for resources that will assist you in overcoming your fears, visit livingbeyondyourfears.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, where 3 times a week we move to a life beyond our fears.